Okay, we are ready to get rolling. So you'd take your seats, and great. Good morning. Welcome to the 5th biannual In the Footsteps of Norman Maclean Festival. I'm Jerry O'Connell, and I'm going to be your host for the day. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be doing this weekend. Today, you'll be hearing from a variety of speakers on a topic, this year's topic, finding our place in nature, the power of story. We'll get into more details about what that's involved in a moment. Point out tonight, here at the Wilma, Rick Bass and the Montana Project will be presenting an evening with the Black Ram guitar. Rick will, at the end of the day today, give you a little overview of what that's all about. Tomorrow, we had four, we actually have three outdoor events that are in the program that you have in your hands. The tour of the Milltown site has been canceled for reasons outside our control, unfortunately. But the other three are there. Some of those require you to pre-register, so check them out in the program. And if you don't have a program, our team out back will get one for you. I would first like to note that the Norman Maclean Literary Festival is proud that today's event is being held on what is the original Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We thank them for letting us do this. Now let's talk about why we're here today. In the footsteps of Norman Maclean Festival, and we have sometimes shortened that to the Maclean Literary Festival, it was founded in 2015 to honor the literary legacy of Norman Maclean, who grew up here in Missoula and went on to write the acclaimed novella, The River Runs Through It. Subsequent festivals since then explored the past, how the history of the West was written, our history of Western expansion, and the policies and politics that shaped our nation. The most recent festival we had 2 years ago was titled Public Lands and Sacred Ground. It examined the unique heritage of our American wilderness and our present responsibility to preserve it. Literature's role in restoring public lands and protecting indigenous places was the focus. We've carried that thought forward to today. This year's festival is to raise people's awareness of our true place in a natural world, not as a dominant species, but as a peer among all other members of nature. Why'd we choose this? Take a look around you. The oceans are filling up with plastic trash. Our forests are shrinking. Past 10 years have been the hottest 10 years in 174 years of scientific record keeping. The pace of species extinctions continues to grow. Scientists agree we are damaging this beautiful blue ball of a planet Earth, and if we don't make significant changes soon, it's going to continue to get worse. But in order to really heal our planet, humanity must first reconnect with the natural world. The indigenous tribes knew how to do that, and they inherently understood this connection, and they were able to live in harmony with nature for 10,000 years. And then 400 years ago, the civilized world arrived and in North America, and we've shifted from being part of nature to trying to control nature. And as it turns out, we kind of suck at it. So, how can we change as individuals and as a species to find our rightful place in nature? And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today. What can you expect to gain from today's festival? One, we hope you can all gain a new perspective of humanity's intended role in the natural world. Challenge your views of nature. And hopefully, and most importantly, we hope each of you can leave here today with a personal call to action, with ideas on how you can contribute and how you can get involved in this healing process that we're going to be hearing a lot about today. This year's festival is dedicated to Barry Lopez. Barry was a renowned nature writer, the late Barry Lopez, I should say. He was a renowned nature writer and visionary. His work is known for its humanitarian and environmental concerns in a career that spanned over 50 years. We're going to have a panel of writers, including Barry's wife, Deborah Gortney. They'll be discussing his influence on writers everywhere and his new book, Going to Sea, in which 30 distinguished writers speak of his influence that he had on their work. Quick list of who you're going to be seeing and hearing from today. First, we're going to start with two of the leading voices in environmental activism today. Physicist Marcelo Gleiser, followed by our keynote speaker and world-famous climate activist Bill McKibben. This will be followed by that panel discussion about Barry Lopez that I mentioned earlier. And then to close out the morning, we're going to hear from John Potter. John is a Montana-based artist whose painting of the last year's release of a new bison herd onto the Blackfeet Reservation at the base of Chief Mountain forms a signature image of this year's festival. We're going to do Q&A at the end of each session. We'll break for lunch at 12:15 and reconvene an hour and 15 minutes later. And FYI, there's Caras Park has a whole bunch of food trucks in it today. So it's an easy, quick lunch if that's the way you want to do it. This afternoon, we'll focus on how we can begin the healing process our world so desperately needs. We'll hear from scientists, activists, and revolutionary farmers about what can be done and what's actually already being done to change our direction. These remarkable folks include Rosalyn Lapier, Mary Margle, Liz Carlisle, Latrice Tatsi, Nikiko Masumoto, and several members of the groundbreaking Held versus State of Montana climate change lawsuit. Final event of the day will be the raffle. There's raffle tickets up there. Please feel free to buy a handful and stick them in the boxes of whichever event you want to have a drawing on. One final note before we get rolling. You notice today's festival is free. We've been doing that for the past several festivals, and it's worked out great. We like that, and I'm sure you like that as well. However, these are not free to put on. They cost a fair amount of money to put this together. Some of our costs are covered by grants. Well, we also depend on voluntary contributions to make this work. Hopefully, you're interested in participating in that. There's an envelope in your program if you wish to do that. There's also QR codes on the back of it so you can make a contribution through Venmo or PayPal. Or if you don't have either of those, speak to any of our staff in the back, we'll get it done. But if you can do that, we really thank you very much. We're going to start this morning with a Zoom call with Marcelo Gleiser.
Marcelo's not on the Zoom, so we're going to start with Bill.
Okay. Like I was saying, Marcelo's not on the Zoom. So we're going to start with our keynote speaker, Bill McKibben. When you're in a hole, stop digging. That's the opinion of Bill McKibben. He is a world-renowned climate specialist. He's an environmental author whose 1989 book, The End of Nature, was regarded as the tipping point to make climate change a household word and open it to the awareness of everybody worldwide. He's since written 20 books. His works regularly appear in periodicals like The New Yorker and Rolling Stone. He serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar of Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. He helped found 350.org. I'm sure you've seen lots of information about that. It's the first global root climate change campaign, has organized protests on climate change on every continent. Most recently, he started the Third Act. It's a foundation that's organizing people ages 60 and over for action on climate and justice, again, worldwide. So with that, I would like to welcome Bill McKibben.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for that introduction. And thank both of you for this good work here today. Well, what a pleasure to be here. I'm the outlier here because I come from the east, from the mountains of the east, which I love. And so, in certain ways, I don't completely belong. But, you know, Norman Maclean did his undergraduate work at Dartmouth University. And while he was there, he was able to study with Robert Frost, the great poet of, in some ways, of America, but of the American East for sure. I've made my life on the Green Mountains of Vermont. In fact, we built our house on land that Frost once owned when we started the first great climate march, really, that this country has seen in 2006. The length of Vermont, we started from Frost's old riding cabin because he's sort of our patron saint, so I feel a little connected, at least in that way. And I feel deeply, deeply connected to Barry Lopez, whose memory this festival is honoring. Not only was he as great a writer as our era has produced, but he was also deeply, deeply committed to fixing the world in all kinds of ways. And he took that very seriously, including organizing the wonderful community of nature writers in this country to do more than just their writing. And so many of us, you'll hear from Rick Bass and Gretel Ehrlich and Kurt and Deborah a little bit later, and I know that Terry Tempest Williams, who was here last time, I think, for this festival, feels exactly the same way, because I was talking to her just the other day. It's a real privilege for any of us just to get to think and talk about Barry, who we miss enormously. It's also really just fun to be in Missoula and on a beautiful day. I've been coming here on and off for a long, long time. The very first time I ever came was to visit an old writer friend of mine named Brian DeSalvatore. And the place we went to give a talk was I'm told, now disappeared institution called Freddie's Feed and Read. And I've remembered it my whole life because I've done a lot of readings and a lot of talks, but only once in a feed store, and that was good fun. So, look, we're here to talk about story. And so I'm going to tell you a couple of different stories, and one of them's very, very tough and grim and necessary to tell because it's the story that we're living at the moment on this planet. And we're just going to go through it, and I offer no great apology for it. It needs to be done, at least so we know where we are. And then I'm going to offer a couple of other stories that are a little less grim. In fact, in certain ways, quite beautiful. But let's start with the hard stuff. I did write the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect back in the 1980s. And it was a series of warnings based on the science about what would happen if we didn't stop burning coal and gas and oil and hence heating up the planet. And we didn't stop burning coal and gas and oil, and now all those warnings are coming true with extraordinary speed and power. And right now, really, we're now deep in the heart of this. January 2023, so about 18 months ago, something like that, I started getting calls from oceanographer friends of mine who were saying, you better go look at the new incoming data on ocean temperatures. They've obviously been going steadily up for decades now, but beginning around the beginning of 2023, they started spiking, and dramatically around the world. By June of last year, there were buoys off the Florida Keys measuring the hottest temperatures we've ever seen in the oceans. It was day after day 101 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about the temperature that you turn your hot tub to, okay? And by June, that heat was coming onshore everywhere. We're able to calculate the daily average temperature of planet Earth because we have enough thermometers in satellites, in buoys, in weather stations around the world. And so we know every day what the average temperature for the day is. And it's always highest in the weeks around the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere because there's a considerable more land mass to soak up heat in the northern hemisphere. So in those days, right after the solstice last year, scientists were saying day after day, this day has just broken the record for the hottest day that we've ever measured. Our measurements go back, as Jerry was saying, a couple of hundred years, because that's how long we've had thermometers. But scientists are very good at figuring out proxy records, glacial cores, things like that, that allow us to run that record much further back. And so scientists were saying with great confidence that those days in the summer of 2023 were the hottest days on planet Earth in at least 125,000 years. 125,000 years ago was right about the moment, anthropologists tell us, when people started etching symbols on bone. So we're living on a hotter planet than anyone else before us. And those temperatures have just kept going up. Every month since June of 2023 has been the hottest month of its kind ever. We broke those 2023 temperatures during the solstice this year. 2024 will be the hottest year we've ever recorded, we're almost certain now. And it's come with all the things that scientists told us it would come with. In fact, they're appearing somewhat more quickly than we would have guessed 30 years ago, mostly because scientists by their nature are very conservative about what's going on. So we're seeing the very rapid melt at both poles. The data from the last few months on the way that the biggest glaciers in the Antarctic are being rapidly undercut by warm water in the Southern Ocean would curl your hair. We're seeing the flickering of the great ocean currents in the Atlantic as fresh water pours into the top of the North Atlantic from the melt in Greenland and elsewhere. With a recent spate of scientific papers predicting we might well see the partial or more shutdown of the Gulf Stream and its allied currents by sometime in the next 15 years, something like that. We're seeing in the Amazon, I'm just listing the largest physical features on Earth if you're paying attention. We're seeing in the Amazon a mega drought of a kind that's never been observed before. and it's been enough to set off massive fires. And we think now to begin shutting down the kind of water transport system that the rainforest represents, where rain moves inland across that great, magnificent system. The savannification of the Amazon appears to be well underway. On land, what we're seeing, of course, the most is really remarkable shifts in the hydrological cycle, in the way that water moves around the planet. If you wanted one fact to understand our time on Earth, it would probably be warm air holds more water vapor than cold. So in arid areas, we're seeing evaporation, and then we're seeing drought. And when the temperature gets high enough, we're inevitably seeing fire. For my money, Norman Maclean's greatest book was Young Men and Fire. And it's prescience about the fact that fire was going to become a dominant motif of the world in which we live is sad fact. Those fires are enormous. I was in Billings and Bozeman last week, and the sky was dark with the smoke from those fires. Last year in Canada, the fires were so intense that Canada, a country of 30 million people, became the 5th largest carbon emitter on planet Earth, right up there with China and India and the US, because there was so much carbon pouring out of those unprecedented fires. But once that water's up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down, and now it comes down in deluge and downpour of a kind that we've never seen before. The most obvious current example is the one that you have been looking at for the last 24 hours in the pictures out of the Carolinas and Tennessee and Florida. The mountaintops of North Carolina were getting very near 4 feet of rain in the course of 24 hours. That breaks their old records, not by an inch or two, but by a foot or two. It's the kind of rainstorms you can only have on a globally warmed planet. That hurricane came across a Gulf of Mexico that was warmer than we've ever measured it before in our hurricane season. And so now, city of Asheville is cut off on all sides. Every interstate connection in and out is closed right now. They're rescuing people off the rooftops of hospitals in Tennessee, on and on and on. But if you think it's terrible here, and it is, it's far worse in the parts of the world that lack the money to provide resilience. Last year, North Africa had the biggest rainstorms it's ever had, although right at the moment they're having another siege of storms of the same scale. That rainfall was so bad in, say, Libya, that it washed out 2 dams in the major river, which then swept into a coastal city where it washed 10,000 people out to sea, where they drowned in an hour. That kind of thing happens pretty regularly in the developing world. And the particular horror of it is, of course, that nobody in those places did the slightest thing to cause the problem they're now being crushed by. The entire continent of Africa produces about 3% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The 3% of human beings that live in the US have produced about 25% of those greenhouse gases. And it's all still up there. The stuff that came out of the tailpipe of my family's maroon Plymouth Fury in 1974 when I was getting my learner's permit is still up there trapping heat. Okay? This is by far the biggest thing that humans have ever done already by orders of magnitude, and it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. We've raised the temperature of the Earth 1.5 degrees Celsius so far, about 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's caused the havoc that I've described. We're on a trajectory to raise it by the mid to latter part of this century about 3 degrees Celsius. If we do that, we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. That is too much violent chaos and flux. Among other things, the UN predicts that it would produce somewhere between 1 and 3 billion climate refugees. That is 1 person in 4 or so on this planet having to pick up and move because their house was underwater or on fire or you couldn't grow food there anymore or whatever it was. 1 million refugees on our southern border was enough to turn our politics into the vicious, ugly mess that it is at the moment. Multiply that by 1,000 times and try to imagine what kind of world we're inhabiting. And that's before we discuss what it does to our ability to raise food or anything else. So, the most important human task there's ever been is not to stop global warming. That's no longer possible. It is to stop it short of the place where it cuts civilization off at the knees. And the thing that makes that task particularly difficult is if we're going to do it, we have to do it very fast. This is not like other political issues, which we are used to, where we just argue about them forever and make small progress back and forth. We've been talking about whether or not we should have national health care in this country as long as I've been alive. And I think it's a sin that we don't, and I trust that someday we will, like every other industrialized country, and that'll be great because people will stop going bankrupt and dying, but it won't make it harder to do it once we decide to do it, that we didn't do it for all those decades. Climate change isn't like that. Once you've melted the Arctic, nobody has a plan for how you freeze it back up again. This is a one-way ratchet that we're playing with. The rough estimate of the time scale goes like this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's climate scientists, told us 3 years ago now that if we wanted to stay anywhere near that pathway that we set out in Paris in 2015, we would need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is 5 years and 4 months away. And that alone, if nothing else, explains why I'm spending all my time on the road in the purple states between now and November 5th. I'm glad that you're here today, but man, I hope you're out tomorrow figuring out how to put John Tester back in the Senate because we very badly need him there. Look, this is the last presidential election that's going to count in that sense on this stuff. So, that's the tough story. It's the real story. It's exactly where we are. And unless we intervene dramatically, that'll be how the story plays out. Okay? But now I'm going to take a breath, and you can take a breath, and we will move on to a slightly different story and a more encouraging one. Because it turns out that we actually know what we need to do, and we're entirely capable of doing it. Almost all the climate crisis, upwards of 80%, stems from the burning of coal and gas and oil. So it stands to reason that we need to stop doing that if we're going to materially affect that 3-degree number. Coal and gas and oil have been good stuff, and they're at the heart of our economy. So it's not easy to imagine how we do without them, except that in the last decade, engineers have dropped the price of renewable energy energy from the sun about 90%. That's an enormous change. Sometime 3 or 4 years ago, it crossed some line where it became cheaper than energy from burning coal and gas and oil. A way to say this, I was talking with some of your wonderful local environmentalists last night, and I just said the thing to bear in mind is we now live on a planet where the cheapest way to make energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a different world than the one that all of us grew up in, and a much, much more hopeful one. In fact, in the few places that have really gone all out trying to do what they can do, we're starting to see remarkable change. Right now, right in the same months that the planet is going over the falls in terms of its temperature, it's also June 2023, which was, as I told you, the month that we had the highest temperatures in 125,000 years, was also the month where we passed the point where humans were putting up a gigawatt's worth of solar panels every 24 hours. That's about a nuclear power plant's worth of solar panels every 24 hours. Now, half of that's in China, but that still leaves a fair amount in the rest of the world. And one of the places that really went at this hard over the last 4 or 5 years was the state of California, which put up a lot of solar panels, and it put up a lot of batteries on its grid because they got way cheaper too. And what's happened this year is that every single day since the 1st of March, California has generated more than 100% of its electricity needs from renewable energy for some considerable portion of the day. That's brand new. That's never happened before. At night, when the sun goes down, the biggest source of supply to the grid in California is now those batteries that have been soaking up sunshine all afternoon. Here's what that means in practice. California in 2024 has used 29% less natural gas to produce electricity than it used last year to this point. That's a big number because California is the 5th largest economy in the world. Those lights are in my eyes, so I'm going to put the cap back on. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, arguably the most modern economy in the world. And it's all of a sudden in 1 year cutting its consumption of fossil fuel to produce power by 1/3. That's a big number. That starts to cut into that 3 degrees Celsius if we can make it spread. And we can because we're seeing it starting to happen in other places. Here's another story, little story from this year. It comes from Pakistan. Pakistan, which, by the way, has suffered more from climate change than any country on earth, I think. They've had the 2 biggest floods since Noah in the last decade. 1/3 of the country covered with water, tens of millions of people displaced. And again, through no fault of their own. At any rate, earlier this year, people began to notice that demand on the Pakistani electric grid had dropped about 10%. That was strange because that only happens in a deep recession or something like COVID, but the economy still seemed to be expanding in Pakistan. So what was going on? The answer to that puzzle began to emerge as people looked hard at Google Earth images and saw rapid spread of people putting up solar panels on top of their stores, their factories, their malls, their homes at Karachi and Islamabad and Lahore. And Chinese solar panels had gotten so cheap that without any help from the government, without anyone asking or anything, people were just going out and nailing them on the roof. Pakistan, so far in the last 6 months, has put up the equivalent of 30% of its electric grid in solar panels. Just people going out and doing this, okay? And the same thing can be observed now across large parts of Africa. And in in many cases in places where people didn't even really have access to electric power before. But it's really remarkable to see the speed with which this is happening. If we could make it happen in enough places very quickly, then we stand some chance. And it is happening in some other places. Texas is going to be the next California. This year, they're outdoing the Californians, and by a pretty large margin, in putting up solar panels and batteries. We'll have those same kind of numbers, I think, out of Texas next year. But Montana is busy building a new gas-fired power plant over by Billings. That's insane. Y'all are going to be paying for it for 40 years, never mind the climate cost, in a moment when the rest of the world is figuring out that we need to move in a new direction. And of course, Montana is blessed as few other places are, with both sun and wind. It would be a remarkable gift to the rest of the country and the world if you all would figure out how to do the work of developing all of that. But of course, you know the reason why that's hard, too. And that's the next story I'm going to tell you. So we have one very grim story, one very hopeful story, and now one story about the just sheer fact of politics and power in our world. This would be a hard transition to make just because of the scale that's required, even if everybody was working in good faith to make it happen. But everybody isn't working in good faith to make it happen. Because when, say, the gas industry hears those numbers from California that gas sales are down 29% because people are switching to solar panels, they do not celebrate that fact. They feel a mortal threat to their collection of reserves of coal and gas and oil that at the moment are worth trillions, tens of trillions of dollars in this country, but that won't be worth much at all if we actually do the thing that we need to and can do. And so their goal becomes trying to slow down this transition by any means possible, which among other things this year means dumping unprecedented amounts of money into the Trump campaign, because they know that Project 2025, which they helped write, is precisely a recipe for slowing down that transition as much as they can. Donald Trump has happily proclaimed that on day one of his presidency, he would stop wind. That's the reason that we started organizing. And it took me a little too long to figure out that we needed to organize, I think. I was a writer, and writers, I think, are prone to the notion that if you win the argument, that's the key thing, you know? My thought when I wrote my first book about all this, my theory of change was people will read my book and then they will change. And they did read it. I mean, it came out in 24 languages, so no complaints, you know. But that's not how it works. It took me about 10 years to realize that we had won the argument. There was no longer the slightest doubt about what was going on with climate change. We were just losing the fight, because that fight was not about data and reason and evidence. That fight was about what fights are normally about, which is money and power. And the fossil fuel industry had so much money, and hence so much power, that they were able to, keep their business model ticking along quite merrily, despite the fact that they had lost the argument over what was happening in the world. We know now that Companies like Exxon knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s. When I was writing my book, they had their scientists hard at work on it. It was the biggest company in the world, and its product was carbon. So of course they were going to find out, and they did. Archives and whistleblowers have dug up the documents that their scientists were presenting to their executives, predicting with uncanny accuracy what the temperature was going to be in 2020 and what the results of that would be. And those scientists were believed. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs higher in the 1980s to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. What they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, across this industry, they invested billions in building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for 30 years in a completely sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real. A debate that both sides knew the answer to at the start. It's just one of them was willing to lie, and it was the most consequential lie in human history because it cost us the thing we most needed, which was time. That's why we've got 5 years now instead of 35 years to do this work, and why it's so hard. Too late now for them to engage really in climate denial of the kind of classic sort. There have just been too many fires and floods for most people to take them seriously. So now they've switched to what you would call solutions denial, arguing that it's sun and wind and batteries aren't ready yet to do the job, and that we need a few more decades of their hydrocarbons to the president of Occidental Petroleum 2 days ago in New York told a crowd that we should continue to build these ridiculous and expensive carbon capture machines on top of gas-fired power plants so that, in her words, they could get every last molecule of oil and gas out of the ground over the decades and centuries to come, instead of just making the switch to where we need to go. Instead of writing this new story, which is, if you think about it, a beautiful story. Human beings have been setting things on fire for 700,000 years or so. The earliest archaeological evidence, much of it that we have of humans, are campfire rings, that they can carbon date back to that era. And fire was good. I mean, we learned to cook food. That gave us the big brain. We could move north and south from the equator. Nobody was settled along the Clark Fork before there was fire. The anthropologists even think that it, millennia is standing around the campfire at night, produced some of the tight social bonds that mark our species. The campfire was a kind of proto-Zoom, and then when we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil, that was the Industrial Revolution, and it produced modernity and everything that we know in our world. It's just the price is too high now. The destruction of the climate, which is a pretty big price, and in the meantime, every year on this planet, 1 death in 5, 9 million people a year, die from breathing the particulates that come when you burn coal and gas and oil. If you've been to Delhi or Shanghai in recent years, that won't completely surprise you, but it happens here too. There are hundreds of thousands of cases a year of childhood asthma in this country just tied to breathing those particulates, and we know who gets to live next to the highway and near the refinery, and that's another reason why this is a big justice issue, and another reason why it's so beautiful to imagine that we could very quickly dispense with it. The good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away. We now have the wit to make full use of it. We can capture its rays on those photovoltaic panels. We can take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the wind that turns those turbines. It's kind of a miracle I mean, I'm a sometime Methodist Sunday school teacher, so this is the closest we're going to get from water into wine, in our moment on earth. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect. You have to do some mining to get it done, lithium and cobalt and copper and things. And we need to try and do that in as ways that are as environmentally sensitive and as sensitive to the people who have to do it as we can. But the scale of that is vastly smaller than what we do at the moment. And if you think about it even for a minute, you'll figure out why. You mine some lithium and you put it in a battery, and it lasts for 25 years doing its job, and then at the end we now know how to recycle that, okay? If you mine some coal, what do you do with it? You set it on fire, and you have to go mine some more the next day. The best guess is that the material demand would drop something like 80% in a renewable energy world. The most recent estimates from a couple of weeks ago are that the total volume of minerals you need to mine between now and 2050 to make this transition is smaller than the volume of coal that was mined last year on this planet. A way to make this sort of stick in your mind is to remember that 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is just carrying coal and oil and gas back and forth across the seas to be burned. But the sun's happy to do that. It makes that journey every day. The wind moves across the planet every day. We don't need that anymore. And so it's possible to imagine this story that isn't the story that we've been telling for the last 30 years. We've had to build the climate movement on the back of anger and guilt and fear and sadness, which are very real and very appropriate emotions, but at some level they start to produce a kind of paralyzing anxiety too. And I think we've maxed them out. We need some joy and hope and adventure, and that's what this represents. The last time we had a sort of group technological project anything like this was the moonshot in the 1960s, which had, among other things, a kind of unifying effect amid a otherwise chaotic stretch of American history. We could use a little unity going forward. That was a project to put two people on a different planet. This is a project to bring another planet, a star, down to our own and use it to safeguard the beauty and integrity of this planet that we were lucky enough to be born on. But it won't happen automatically. We have to make it happen. And so here I'm going to end by talking just for a minute about what we need to do. I'm not an organizer by inclination. I'm a writer. Writers, if they had some other way of, engaging the world, they probably would. But, all of this is a way of saying, it's nice to be here with you, but really, given my druthers, I'd rather be home in my room typing, That's what I like to do. But we've learned to organize. We started 350.org, which became the first global grassroots climate campaign, with myself and 7 college students, one of them the wonderful Montanan Jeremy Osborne. He was at Middlebury College, where I hang out with the others, and we started this thing. And we had no idea what we were doing. I mean, there were 7 college students, there are 7 continents, each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic had to take the internet as well, we just set out. But within 3 or 4 years, we'd had the first big global grassroots climate demonstration, 5,200 simultaneous protests in 181 countries. And we helped launch this fight against the Keystone Pipeline, which became a big battle of the last decade. And then we helped launch the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which became the largest anti-corporate campaign of its kind ever. We're at about $40 trillion now in institutions that have sold their stock in coal and gas and oil. And the point I want to make right now is that it was young people who accomplished most of that stuff. Those divestment campaigns happened on thousands of college campuses. And the kids who did them were fantastic, and when they graduated, they wanted to keep going, and they did. They founded this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal, and it was that Green New Deal, once Congress had, run it through its sausage-making machinery, that became the Inflation Reduction Act and is the first real effort that our Congress has had to do anything at all about this problem, and is providing the money that's jump-starting some of this renewable energy. So thank them for that. And thank all those young people, much younger people, really exemplified by Greta Thunberg, that set to work around the world to raise everybody's consciousness again about 5 or 6 years ago. Greta's one of my favorite people in the world to work with. I adore her. And I had the pleasure last summer of writing her a long letter congratulating her on her graduation from high school. Think about that for a minute. There were 10,000 Gretas, and there were 10 million kids out on climate strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. So they've done their part, which you would expect, because they're the ones who are staring down the barrel of this gun most profoundly. I'll be dead before the very worst of this happens, but they won't unless we get it under some kind of control and fast. So it's appropriate that they're out in the lead. However, the one bad side effect of that was that I started hearing a few too many people my age say, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem. And if they really wanted to rub salt in the wound, sometimes they would stare at a young person and say, you give me hope. This is not okay. Among other things, it's not morally okay, but it's also strategically unsound, because for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, by themselves, young people lack the structural power to make change on the scale that we need in the time that we have. Okay? Greta may be Prime Minister of Sweden someday, but it won't be in the next 5 years, all right? So when you start looking around for who does have that kind of influence, I said to someone the other day, if you've reached the age when you have hair coming out your ears, you may well have structural power coming out your ears as well. That's why we started organizing this third act thing 2 years ago. There are 70 million Americans over the age of 60. That's a lot. There's 10,000 more every day, which is actually more than the number of people born in this country every day. We punch above our weight politically because we all vote. There is no known way to stop old people from voting, okay? And we ended up with most of the money. We got like 70% of the country's financial assets. So if you want to push around, Helena or Washington or Wall Street, doesn't hurt to have some people with hairlines like mine. Now, I can barely see you all out there in the lights, but I sense there might be 2 or 3 more people my age in this room, and the rest of you need to tell your grandparents about what we're doing, because it's really fun. We've got now about 100,000 volunteers working across the country, and they're doing incredible work. Some of that work is straightforward, electoral work. Right now, that's all we're doing. We even have a PAC now, Gray PAC, and we're, people are writing 200,000 postcards a week into the swing states and getting on buses from all over the country to go to Nevada and go to Pennsylvania and things, to knock on doors, because it turns out that Americans will still answer the door if there is a 75-year-old lady on the other side, okay? And so that's all good. But we're also doing all kinds of other stuff. You know, all over the country, we've trained people up now to go to the public service commissions, which are the ones in a state like Montana that are approving these insane gas plants, you know. And they've been protected for decades because they're surrounded by a force field of boringness, and because they meet during the week, you know, and so the only people who show up are the lobbyists from the utilities, and they capture them easily. But now in state after state, there's 30 or 40 people sitting there, you know, crocheting and doing the crossword puzzle and listening and intervening, and that's turns out to make a big difference. And bless their hearts, people are doing all kinds of other stuff too. One of our big campaigns has been to take on the banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the 4 biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. They won't stop, despite every scientific authority saying we can't build more fossil fuel infrastructure. They just keep supplying them capital to do it. So we've been doing our best to make that point. Last year we had in one day 100 simultaneous demonstrations in 100 cities outside these banks, and did our best in a bunch of places to shut them down for a little while. We've reached the age where sprawling on the concrete for 4 or 5 hours at a time is less appealing than it might once have been. So I was in Washington. We went to all the Goodwills and got every rocking chair in the greater metro area. They shut them down for the day. The Times the next day had a big story about the rocking chair rebellion that was underway. So it's good to see that happening, and we need lots more of it, and we need lots more people engaged in it and doing all that they can. I'm not going to tell you, though, that if we do all this, we're going to win, because I do not know. We don't know the outcome to this story. And that's a somewhat new place, I think, for us to be in. My great hero, Dr. King, used to end every speech by saying, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," by which he meant, this may take a while, but we're going to win, which was a great comfort to the extremely brave people in the civil rights movement, okay? We don't have that particular comfort. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win this thing fast, then we don't win it. And frankly, there are days when I am scared that we have waited too long to really get started, that the momentum of some of these physical systems has become too large to check. But we don't know. The best guess scientifically is that we still have some window to prevent the very worst, but it's a narrow window and it's closing. And so that's why all of this seems so incredibly urgent to me, and why I do what I do in my life, and why so many others do too. We will find out the answer to this story, which version of this story turns out to be the real one, in the lifetimes of everyone in this room. It's going to be the next 5 years that tells the tale about what happens, whether we get enough momentum going to build out in the ways that we must, a different world, one that relies on the sun, one that relies, here's my Sunday school teacher hat again, one that relies on energy from heaven instead of hell. That's the possibility here. But it's not a guarantee or even a probability. It's just a chance, and a chance that we've got to seize in order to write this story the way that we need it to come out. Thank you all very much. And thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll get Q&A.
We have enough for questions, is that what we want to do?
Yeah. All right, Q&A. Yep. He's pretty good at this. I am sure there are questions out here. So if anybody has some questions, raise your hand. We have people with microphones to travel up and down and get them to you. So raise them up. It's hard for me to see a hand. Oh, there, Deborah's got, okay, we have one.
First, thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful to hear. My question is, what are your thoughts on nuclear energy?
What are my thoughts on nuclear energy? It's a good question. By the way, I should have said, as Jerry said earlier today, come if you can tonight to this concert that's going to happen here at the Wilma at 7:30 that Rick Bass has been arranging. I get to MC it, and it's going to be lots and lots of remarkable music performed in large measure on this guitar made from a windfall Engelmann spruce from up there in the Yak Valley that people are trying so hard to save from clear cut. And it's going to be, should be a really moving and powerful evening. Nuclear power is interesting in that you can produce it without much in the way of carbon, okay? And so if you have a nuclear power plant running someplace at the moment, I wouldn't hurry to shut it down. But I don't think there's any sign that it's going to be a huge part of the answer here. And the biggest reason for that is cost. We can produce power from the sun at a couple of cents a kilowatt hour, and we can put up major solar fields in the course of a year, you know, as long as we can connect them to the grid somehow. But nuclear power plants, because they're big, take a long time, and they're expensive, really expensive to build. So there's only a few countries on Earth that are really doing them very hard at all, and most of them have some other use for the plutonium in mind as well, to sort of make it a, you know, to give it that, make it worth doing. There may be a few places on the planet that lack the land area to easily do this. There's only a few, but to do renewable energy. South Korea and Japan being the most obvious examples. But even they are now doing a lot of offshore wind, which is also very, very cheap compared to nuclear power. So maybe we'll get small modular reactors at some point that are cheap enough to make sense. So far, they haven't really been delivering on that. The first generation of them still seem pretty expensive, but we shall see. In the meantime, if you know someone who really likes nuclear power, and there are people who really like it, console them with the fact that the sun is a big, giant nuclear reactor. It's just one at a kind of safe remove from the rest of the Earth.
I was wondering what advice you would have and what might be feasible for those of us who aren't able to own a home to try to put pressure on our landlords to maybe install some solar panels, and just kind of trying to think through what might be tangible, because on one hand I kind of want to say screw it, let's just go do it and deal with their reactions afterwards, but also I don't want to be evicted, so any advice would be greatly appreciated.
No worries. What many states have done with this is set up programs called community solar. I don't think Montana currently really, I don't know what the, but it allows people who can't put solar on their own roofs for whatever reason, including tenancy, to figure out, to join together with others to produce the electricity that they're paying for through solar, and it's a good plan. But it's also a good moment to be just talking with your landlord about using electricity in general, all right? And as they go through replacement cycles for things, we've got to be very quickly moving in the direction of electricity. We've got to be putting out the fires. So the fire in your basement doesn't need to be there anymore, because now we have heat pumps that work better and more cheaply than furnaces. The large open campfire in your kitchen doesn't need to be there anymore, because now we've got magnetic induction cooktops that work better. The cook in our house, for years I've had one from Amazon that costs $60. I can't tell you exactly how it works, something to do with magnets, but it works great and uses very little energy. And of course, the third in that trinity of appliances is the EV, or better yet, the e-bike, if you can do that. You can put out the fire underneath the hood of your car. So I talk to your landlord and explain that these things make a great deal of economic as well as environmental sense. And the next time that they're switching out anything, encourage them to go in that right direction. There's now considerable money from the IRA to make that easier.
Am I cutting in or cutting out? No, thank you again for your energy expenditure. I know this has to be terribly draining and a lot of work. During your talk, you kept using the word price, and I'm curious about cost. You kind of touched on the cost of lithium and mining. Is there data out there on the true cost of everything you talked about, which is just switching energy source instead of decreasing consumption? I'm sometimes dissatisfied we don't talk enough about decreasing energy consumption.
I agree with that. And I've spent much of my life working on questions around consumption. I wrote a book called Deep Economy once that is a real effort to kind of grapple with our addiction to growth. And the argument in it above all was that the high consumption society that we live in isn't producing happiness on the scale that it tells us that it is. So my guess is that in 50 or 100 years, we'll live in we'll take our satisfaction in different things, and that'll be very good. But I don't think that that's going to happen on a scale large enough to matter in the course of the next 5 years. My guess is that people will still be living in more or less the same places in more or less the same ways, and getting around to more or less the same jobs and things in the time frame that's now relevant to dealing with the salvation of the planet's climate system. So that's why I think that this substitution of clean energy for dirty energy is probably the biggest part of the moment that we're in, while we're continuing to work on all those other really important things. It's really good to be in a place, for instance, where local agriculture is obviously really important, you know. And it was great fun to walk through the farmer's market this morning. But also, when I was in Billings, saw the giant sugar beet, you know, refinery there on the edge of town. And my guess is that and corn syrup and so on are going to continue to be what we mostly do in agriculture in the relevant time period. So the question of thinking through all this economically is really important. And one of the things that I haven't even bothered talking about, and we don't talk about in our world, is the unbelievable cost, economic cost, of what we're now doing to the climate. The latest data I saw said that the closest attempt to study it predicted, and of course this is a pretty hard thing to model, but that total climate damage by the end of the century around the world would be if we let the temperature go up to 3 degrees Celsius, would be $551 trillion, which is more money than currently exists on planet Earth. Like, the folly of doing this is so insane. I think the place where that's, in the next year or two, going to become very obvious to everybody is in insurance payments, premiums. Because our world, it's very hard to do anything in the world if you can't hedge risk a little bit, build a house or whatever it is you're going to do. But the tool that allows that to happen, the actuarial table that lets insurance, has turned insurance into, depending on how you measure it, the first, second, or third biggest industry in the world. That actuarial table is a great piece of technology, except that it depends on the planet behaving in the future as it behaved in the past. And now that it isn't, how do you write a premium, a policy for someone in North Carolina if yesterday 4 feet of rain fell on the top of the nearest mountain, which is twice as much as ever fell before? You have no clue how to write insurance, and so people, that's one of the places where in very short order this is going to starting to overwhelm us. You already can't buy insurance in much of California and much of Florida because the wildfire and hurricane risks have meant that the state has to step in as the insurer of last resort. So we're in for some very difficult moments, and they're going to come even if we do this job of putting up all the clean energy that we can, because really, at least for the moment, we're locked into climate chaos at the scale we're seeing now. What we're trying desperately to do is keep it from getting any bigger than it has to get, to the point where it just overwhelms everything. At which point, it must be said, we will then, like it or not, reduce consumption in all kinds of ways. So it's a very live question that you ask, and thank you for it.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm wondering if you'd say a few words about the role of plastic in the climate crisis, as well as how it's pushing us outside of the planetary limits and so many other areas. Plastic.
Plastic. Yes. So plastic is the next, if you tell the fossil fuel industry, we don't need your natural gas anymore in order to produce electricity, their response is, well, first their response is, we're going to make sure we elect people to prevent that from happening. But their next response is, well, if we can't use it for that, let's use it to make plastic with. And about 5%, about 3% of global emissions at the moment are from the plastic industry, but that's expected to double between now and 2050 as they put more and more and more emphasis on doing this. And some of it's literally just impossible to, the cynicism of watching it just makes you almost despair. 2 years ago, there was a big story in the Times, big investigation of the fact that the plastics industry, which is just the petroleum industry, was sending lobbyists by the plane load off to Africa. In some of those African countries, they've actually, over the years, put serious bans on plastic bags. And the reason, usually in those countries, is because they do a terrible job of clogging up the sewer systems, which tend to be rudimentary. But the fossil fuel industry, as their people said, had a lot of data showing that Africa was not consuming as much plastic as it should. And so they were over there busily trying to overturn even those bans on plastic bags in some of the poorest countries in the world. A big part of this entire story and the outcome of it depends on whether or not we can break the political power of the fossil fuel industry. in short order. And every time we put up another solar panel, it produces more carbon-free electricity, but it also, in some incremental way, sucks a little more power out of the political weight out of the fossil fuel industry. And one of the things that makes me so completely committed to trying to win this election is not just that I psychologically am unable to take the prospect of waking up every day for 4 years wondering what new inanity there will be. I will just say in passing that if one of the underappreciated virtues of all other presidents of the United States except Donald Trump was that you could forget about them for long periods at a time, you know. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, that's the part. But the other reason is I think 4 more years in this country of implementing the IRA and building this won't stop we'll still be using fossil fuel at the end of it, but the balance of political power will, I think, at the end of that 4 years have tipped, and that our political system will no longer live in complete fear and subjugation to, you know, the boys in Houston doing their thing. That's the hope anyway. So there I end. Thank you all very much.
The book Going to Sea, Remembering Barry Lopez, will be the topic of our next discussion. Barry Lopez is the legendary writer I mentioned earlier. This panel is going to include authors Rick Bass, Gretel Ehrlich, Barry's wife, Deborah Gwartney, and it will be moderated by Kurt Caswell, who is co-editor of the book Going to Sea. So please welcome Rick Bass, Gretel Ehrlich, Deborah Gwartney, and Kurt Caswell. Kurt will be moderating this discussion, and it'll be followed by Q&A, of course.
Good morning. Thanks for being here today and for joining us in celebrating the life and work of Barry Lopez. I'm Kurt Caswell. I'm a professor at Texas Tech University in the Honors College. And I'm also co-editor of this book, Going to Sea, 30 Writers on Nature, Inspiration, and the World of Barry Lopez, with Jim Warren. Jim Warren's the co-editor. So the way we're going to conduct ourselves here this morning is we're each going to speak for a short time, 5 or 6 minutes, and then we're going to sit down and we'd like to invite you into a conversation, and we'll talk with you and talk to each other, and we can answer questions. You can share your own stories, perhaps. So at Texas Tech University, we have a literary archive called the Sowell Collection. And this collection has brought together about 30 American writers whose work really has always been and is focused on the intersection between people and nature. And as a side note, you know, Barry long rejected this term nature writer and preferred to be talking about community. And he often said that he's not writing about nature, he's writing about humanity, human beings. And the Sowell Collection brings together all of these writers. We have the literary papers of Rick Bass and Gretel Ehrlich, and also Bill McKibben, who's here, as you well know. And hopefully soon we'll have the papers of Deborah Gwartney underneath. When Barry, and those papers started with the papers of Barry Lopez. So when Barry brought his papers to Texas Tech, that was about 25 years ago, the university said, "We really love having you here on campus. Why don't you come and work with us every semester?" And he did. He took on a role as the university's only, so far as I know, only distinguished visiting scholar. And he was on campus every semester for about 20 years. So when I came to Texas Tech, I was privileged with having the opportunity to work closely with Barry for about the last 15 years of his life. And we worked together in the classroom, and we took students into the field. He helped us with our annual SAL conference, and he worked on other initiatives with the president's office and other departments like biology and English and architecture. And so I got to know him fairly well. And all that time that I was working with him, I realized at some point that he'd been mentoring me. And I count him among my greatest teachers. So I want to tell you a little bit about how this book came into being. It was been the spring of 2021, not long after Barry's death, when he would normally come to campus, and I was sitting around and missing him. So I was thinking about all the many gifts that he had given me as a writer, as a teacher, as a human being, as a friend. And it occurred to me that there were so many other people out there who felt the same way. And people all over the world, right, who had read his work in many languages. So I had this idea suddenly that what if I could bring a group of writers together who could say what they wanted to say about Barry, about what he means to them and his influence on them, but also on all of us, and share that with a reader. And I thought, too, that maybe the book would be an entrance point for younger or new generations of writers and readers to get to know Barry beyond his own work, as a person. So I contacted Jim Warren, and Jim Warren is, he's a scholar, also a writer, a longtime friend of Barry's, and he wrote a book about Barry's work. Jim is the guy who, one year at the SAL conference in Lubbock, Texas, Jim had just given a talk about Barry's work, and Barry, sitting in the back of the room, said, "Jim is the guy who has been explaining me to myself for about 20 years." So they were very close. I told this, explained this idea to Jim, and Jim said, "Yes, absolutely, you need to do that, and I want to help you." So Jim came on as the co-editor, and now we have this book in our hands. The book is for sale in the back, and I just wanted to also add that all of the royalties from the sales of the book are donated to the Mackenzie River Trust for the restoration and maintenance of Barry and Deborah's home, former home on the Mackenzie River in Oregon. And I also want to say briefly that I'm sitting on the stage today with my heroes. And I mean that sincerely. When I was an undergraduate, looking for a path, for my own life, trying to figure out how I was going to make the life that I wanted to live, I was reading the work of Gretel Ehrlich and Rick Bass and Bill McKibben, for that matter, and certainly of Barry. And I met Deborah a little later, but her work is stunning, and it seems to me that every year it just becomes more stunninger. Anyway, so it's a real honor to be up here with this group of people and to be talking about Barry's life and work. And I'll turn the microphone over to Gretel.
I'm always too short for this. There we go. Hi. I first met Barry, I don't know, when was that? 1982? No, I mean, I'd met him before then, but he first came to a really remote mountain ranch that my ex and I had. It was impassable most of the year because it was a 17-mile drive up 2,000 feet from the valley floor. And the road was made of bentonite. If you know anything about geology, you'll know that it was always impassable. But it was a snowy year. The road was not passable. It was just kind of hummocks of deep snow. And so we got a call from Barry because he had known my then husband, Press Stevens, from working on a ranch in Jackson, or really Moran, Wyoming, and they were old friends, and he said he wanted to visit, and we said, yeah, sure. So we harnessed our team of Belgian mares to our hay wagon, and we went down the road that way and picked him up at the bottom and went back up. He was our only winter visitor in 11 years. I thought that was very fitting, that it was Barry who was our only winter visitor. And also, in just telling this story, it's a story about how much the climate has changed and what the climate was like in the 80s in northern Wyoming. And also, I think of climate as culture, that it affects, the whole thing about, are we nature writers? I don't know. We are also nature, but I think of things as nations of birds, nations of fish, nations of weathers, and of course nations of people, all distinct from each other, but also pushed into sometimes unintentional community by, even when you live in isolation as we did, that just the arrival of Barry up a really, really cold, snowy winter tells a story that puts a point on the map in terms of what was happening with the weather and the climate in the early 80s, so different from what's happening now. So in that way, I think I was trained as a ethnographic filmmaker at UCLA Film School, and but of course I always wanted to be a writer, but I had to make a living, so I worked on film. And so I started going to the Arctic a little after Barry had been there. You know, we all knew each other, Rick and Peter Matheson and Annie Dillard and all kinds of us who were out in the world, lots of National Geographic people, Wade Davis and Chris Rainier making photographs, and Sylvia Earle. And, we were all out doing things, but we didn't really know where everyone was, but we formed this kind of invisible community of people who were out in sometimes very harsh environments, just trying to see what was there. I mean, really see, without ego, without an agenda, without any preconceptions of anything. And so, it's kind of like scouring yourself down, but, washing yourself down and making you completely open, completely receptive to whatever came your way from moment to moment. And when I think of Barry, just when he came to visit us, we would just go out, with, I don't know if we had snowshoes on, but we were just tromping around. And I always thought of him as somebody who picked up something tiny that the rest of us hadn't seen, and holding it up and looking at it this way, and then this way, and then putting it down and not saying anything, and then going on to the next moment. And that was something, I think, in his writing that we've all learned to remember to do, to not just stumble around. But, we do stumble around, especially as we grow older, as Bill McKibben kept reminding us. But sometimes stumbling helps you see better because you fall down and you think, oh, there's there's an interesting rock or a feather or something. But so there's always this advantage at any age to see everything all the time. Barry was going to the Arctic, more the Antarctic. I've never been there because I was interested in culture. So I wanted to go where there were where I went to northwestern Greenland for on and off for 23 years, 23 seasons. I traveled with subsistence Inuit hunters on a dog sled. And so I first went there in 1993. I just kind of stumbled. The ice was already, the sea ice was already disappearing along the north, the sort of in Umanak, Greenland, the kind of western coast of Greenland. And I was supposed to go on this long dog sled trip. It didn't work because the ice wasn't good enough. So my friends in Umanak said, you must go north to the two northernmost villages, inhabited villages in the world, which are Qaanaaq and Siopperluk. And so I went there. I traveled with an extended family by dog sled for 23 seasons. In 1996, our dog sled started going through the ice. And it was just because those guys are just so incredible at what they do. They got the dogs out. The dogs were already, so these are big freight sleds, 15 dogs pulling them. They're like 12 or 14 feet long. And the dogs were already in the ice. He pulled the lines out and got the dogs out hanging by his feet on the edge of the sled. And then he stepped off on a piece of ice that had already broken away, and he was sinking, and he lifted up this very heavy sled. We had a month's worth of food and equipment on it, and lifted the front and turned it a different direction, jumped on. I pulled him on and said something really nasty in Greenlandic to the dogs, and like, you get your asses going right now or we're all gonna go through the ice. But it was that experience that taught me that something was wrong, that I kind of experienced the changing climate from the soles of my chemics up. And later when we could talk, Yenzi asked me he said, there's something wrong. Please help me understand what's happening to the ice. And so from then on, I tried to educate myself as best as possible about the mechanics of climate change and what was happening not only in the Arctic, and how the Arctic drives the climate of the world, but also what began happening everywhere. But I think one of the things that people who were involved with going outside, that's what I call nature, right? We're people who go outside, and have this opportunity to actually experience in their own bodies what is happening on the planet. And then you go home and then you engage in educating yourself so that you can educate others. And you don't have to be a writer to do that. We should all be doing that, no matter what we're doing. Just getting up in the morning and standing in the sun or in the snow. There's so much going on every second. And so that's kind of what we do. I just remember in Greenland that we talk so much now about glaciers, glacier ice, and sea level rise, but what's really important is albedo, coming from the Latin alba, meaning white, the white surface of the frozen seas, which are all around the top of the world, the polar north. The snows on the Tibetan plateaus and all of North America, here and everywhere, this is what reflects heat back into space. And of course, we're losing most of it. So when I first went to Greenland in 1993, in the winter and spring, you just looked out and it was frozen ocean for as far as the eye could see. It was just white, white, white. And then the Greenland ice sheet was towering above us, sort of melting off like frosting. It was a world of ice, complete ice. And it was also the only pathway for travel in the polar north by dog sled. It was also the livelihood, the habitat of all the marine mammals, the narwhal, walrus, and seals, and the polar bears who rested on drift ice to eat. They ate seals, and we all ate everything. We all ate the same things. And, it was really an extraordinary vista. And now I remember standing with Jens as the ice started going, and he stood there. He has a Danish name, but he's totally Inuit man. And he said, "Whose weather is this?" So we started seeing the ice in the spring when it should have been 10 feet thick, was now that thick. He said, "Whose weather is this? This is not mine. Without ice, it will be a disaster. Without ice, I am nothing at all." And neither are the rest of us, so thank you.
Thank you, Gretel. Thank you, McLean Festival, for honoring Barry and his work. Bill, all the panelists, it's an amazing weekend. I want to be brief. Barry, what I want to not be is rude, so I wanted to look up this poem that made me think of him. And Evan, could you look up Berryman by W.S. Merwin, please? And I'll get it in a bit because it's totally reminds me of remembering Barry. He was, like most deeply intelligent and very alive people, he was two people. And I am, in remembering him, it's really weird to hear his name, and this is the first event I've been at where we've talked about his work and he hadn't been there. I don't like it. I also don't like the pressure because I feel like he's kind of like, he's evasive. Like, he is interested in hearing what we have to say, but he will not let us get around him and define him, and we're not attempting to. But I think my hope for this panel is that he's kind of out there some distance watching, maybe looking down like Gretel was describing at a rock or whatever, looking up now and again and listening, pretending not to care, but he cared. He cared about everything. He was so intense, so fiery, so passionate that I worried about him as a friend. He was a good friend. He was a great letter writer. I would give him shit about that. He spent a lot of time on letters. I like to think that he struggled with fun, not joy, but fun. I don't really have a feel, despite having known him for however many decades, what his relationship with fun was. He loved fun, but what did Leopold say? To possess an ecological awareness is to understand we live in a world of wounds. I can't see in this light. Eben, have you got that beautiful Berryman poem? Thank you. I will tell you what he told me in the years just after the war, as we then called the Second World War. Don't lose your arrogance yet, he said. You can do that when you're older. Lose it too soon, and you may merely replace it with vanity. Just one time he suggested changing the usual order of the same words in a line of verse. Why point out a thing twice? He suggested I pray to the muse. He'd get down on my knees and pray, right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own through which he sailed, chin sideways and head tilted like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was. He was in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. As for publishing, he advised me to paper my wall with rejection slips. His lips and the bones of his long fingers trembled with the vehemence of his views about poetry. He said the great presence that permitted everything and transmuted it in poetry was passion. Passion was genius, and he praised movement and invention. I had hardly begun to read. I asked, how can you ever be sure that what you write is really any good at all? And he said, you can't. You can't, you can never be sure. You die without knowing whether anything you wrote was any good. If you have to be sure, don't write. And that's how he was. His tips of his long fingers would tremble with the vehemence of his opinions about anything, like Carl Yastrzemski's on-base percentage, the foibles of the Department of Interior. There was just nothing that he did not burn in its presence, and that had to be exhausting to be him. And I wonder how he would be now. Like, he would always be ahead of things or behind things. He was so stubborn or obstinate or rebellious or just creative that he could not abide to be, in my perspective, he could not abide to be bounded or predictable. And so if the times were good and fun, he would dial down deep and get super serious. And if things were super serious and intense, he would toss a smoke bomb into the audience. And I think that's just how he was, and he's gone, but he's not gone. We are all ghosts, whether we're living or not, and he's with us. And what we do with his work is yet to be seen. Thank you all. Oh shit! He had an appetite. He would raid food off of people's plates. Little known fact. He was not always a saint. One time he was on the side of Gary Snyder, who was eating a damn cheeseburger. Like, Gary Snyder eating a cheeseburger? What universe is this? And I took a crumb trying to help Gary out, thinking Gary didn't want it, and Gary wanted it. Anyway, Barry saw me picking off Snyder's plate, and he reached over and started. We were like ravens on a carcass.
Goodness, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this panel. It's lovely to be here. Sarah and Jenny and everyone who's put it together, thank you for honoring Barry by dedicating this session to him. That would mean a lot to him. And Bill McKibben, thank you for what you said about him. He felt the same about you, I'm sure you know. I just want to tell a brief story about Barry. Once when we were on our way to Greenland, we were in Nunavut, which is way up north in Canada, and we were in line to do something with our passports with a long line of people, and someone came up to us and said that we needed to go into a room and talk to an RCMP, right, officer, and we both thought, what in the world would we do? And we went in, and there's this gargantuan man there with this uniform and big hat, and if you're imagining a cliche of an RCMP officer, that's who it was. And as soon as he saw Barry, he burst into tears, and I mean burst. This body just burst into tears and sobbing. And he told Barry that one of his assignments was in a dark, deep in the woods cabin for 6 months. I'm not sure what he was doing there, but he rarely saw another human being. And though he had never read a book in his entire life, he found Of Wolves and Men in this cabin, and he read it over and over again until he'd memorized large passages of it. And he said to Barry that day that he truly believed he would have survived that winter of darkness without that book. So, we had, there were enough encounters in my presence like that I came to realize that this was not a fluke, that many, many people would come up to Barry and say, your book changed my life. A handful of people came up to him and said, your book saved my life. And they meant that sincerely. So last week was the 4-year anniversary of the fire that changed Barry's life. I'm sure it precipitated his death. It was an undoing, and it was all climate change caused, of course. it changed my life too. And then a few months later, as you know, he died on Christmas Day. And after that, this onslaught of responses. I mean, I knew that people would respond, but I had no idea. It was a tsunami. It was just amazing how many letters and phone calls and emails and, I mean, everything that was coming in. It was beautiful and generous and loving, and it was so utterly overwhelming. I did not know where to put my feet. And I started to have this panic. I know I talked to Rick about it, that I needed to somehow create this memory of Barry Lopez, this monolith of memory to him. But I didn't know where to even begin. And then when I was reading Rick's piece and going to see, he said, his beautiful piece, Fire Builder, he said this thing that it felt exactly right at that time, which was that what Barry gave was huge. How then could what he took with him, or rather what went away, not also be immense? And I realized that all those people just wanted to connect with his memory, people who had written him one letter or met him for 5 minutes at a reading or just read his work and felt that they knew him well. They all wanted to connect with his memory, and I just simply did not know what to do with that. And then I started to realize that, like everything else on the planet Earth, this had to be a process. It had to just unfold in its own time. I started to think about the absolutely exquisite rock walls that Rick Bass makes, one stone at a time, and how that building those walls takes care of Rick. I'm speaking for you. And I would like to ask this of Rick later, but I don't think you can tell a rock wall how to hold together. I think it has to tell you. And I needed to find that patience of watching Barry's memory become what it needs to be. So it was with great relief that I heard from Kurt and Jim about going to sea. I knew this was a big rock in the wall. And because these two men who loved Barry and who were fiercely loved in return by Barry were going to make this thing. They thought of it, they executed it, and they brought together this array of voices to say something not only about Barry's work, which was so important, but about his moral center, his ethic, his way of being in the world, his observation, his appetite, his sense of humor. Somehow this book has coalesced what he meant in the world. And of course, because I'm a selfish human being, I resonate most with the pieces that talk about our life together as a couple, our 24 years together, our time on the river. It's so nice to re-inhabit a space that I lived in for so long and live no longer. The last night either of us spent in our house was the night of the fire. But anyway, I'm so deeply grateful for the book. I'm honored to have a piece in it. And I hope that you all read it with this idea that Barry will live on. He has to. He was quite worried in the last days about how he'd be remembered. And so thank you for remembering him.
So we'd love to open it up for comments and questions from you.
Thank you for remembering an extraordinary writer and human being. Could you talk about the title? I love the title, but I'm curious where it came from and how it kind of suffuses the book.
So the title was really sort of appeared, I think, in my mind as I put the idea for the book together. And I presented that title to Jim, and I thought, well, it's probably just a working title. We'll get rid of it and get something better later. But Jim loved it a great deal, and it stuck. The title comes from, there's an opening section of the introduction to Horizon, which is the book that, the last book Barry published while he was still alive. And that section is called To Go, To See. To go with a backslash, to see. And so I thought, this characterizes, Barry's life, is that he had this deep desire, this drive to get out into the world and see it for authentic experience. And so I thought that was a fitting title for the book. Just as, since no one's asking a question, I'll pass the microphone around, but it looks like maybe Rick has something to say. But I thought I'd just add that, in my role as a teacher in the Honors College at Texas Tech, where Barry used to spend a lot of time, he was pretty devoted to the Honors College and would come into my classroom often and other classrooms, and he would tell these fantastic stories, to students, and when there'd be a little lull in the conversation, perhaps I would say, tell that story about the hippo. And so then Barry would tell that story. So I've kind of taken it as my, mission to share a lot of the stories that Barry used to tell students in the Honors College, with the current students in the Honors College that I come in contact with. And I tell them the story of Barry's association with Texas Tech and that his papers are there. I take them to the archive. So in that way, I try to keep Barry alive also at Texas Tech, keep his memory alive for everybody there. Rick, did you have something to?
Good time for one more question. We'll wait, give you a mic here.
Is that working? Is it true that Barry was told by a college professor that you don't need to stay in college, you know how to write, just go write?
What you might be referring to, which I heard Barry talk about quite a bit, was that he matriculated through Notre Dame. Barry was the ideal Catholic. He was born on the Epiphany, died on Christmas Day, went to Catholic school his whole life. Even though he said he gave it up, I don't know. But he wanted to get an MFA. It was kind of the rage when he was in the 70s, when he thought he would get an MFA. It was just kind of a new thing. He applied to Iowa, did not get in. And so he thought he would go to the second school, which was University of Oregon, MFA. That's why he moved to Eugene, started that program, and indeed one of the teachers there told him there was no reason for him to be, he'd never be a writer. He just wasn't doing what he needed to do to become a writer, so he should bail, and he did. He never looked back. So he moved into the house upriver in, I think, right around 1970. Lived there for exactly 50 years, the week of the fire, and wrote 23 books. So I think he did okay.
Thank you.
I'll add something to that, which is that I heard that story from Barry a few times, and the reason he was talking about it is because he said to me that writing programs tend to talk a great deal about writers, about becoming a writer, and what they leave out is the reader. And that he had switched that, completely around in his mind and decided that, really what writing is all about is communicating with a reader. It's not about becoming a certain kind of person or taking on a title or putting your name on a book. It's about this exchange with the reader. And he didn't like that about writing programs in general and decided that he could do better, if he left that program.
I would like to thank you guys. I suspect Barry would be very happy with what's gone on here this morning. Thank you very much for your memories.
Thank you all.
Our next topic for the morning is the power of art. And it's specifically about this painting that's represented on this poster here. John Potter lives in Red Lodge, Montana, but was raised in the upper Midwest in constant motion between his parents' home in Chicago and his Lac de Flambeau Res family in northern Wisconsin. His work is a blend of both the traditional art education that he received at Utah State University and the traditional teachings of his Ojibwe elders. He moved to Montana in 1982, went to work at the Billings Gazette as their newsroom artist. He spent 20 award-winning years there before he decided to follow his passion and dedicate his whole time to painting in 2002. His art is now found in private collections around the world and has been featured in magazines like Big Sky Journal, Southwest Art, Art of the West, Cowboys and Indians, and the Western Art Collector. So with that, please welcome John Potter. I hadn't seen him. I was starting to get scared there for a moment.
Snuck in on you. Thank you so much, Jerry. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you introducing the impossible. But nothing easy about that. I got my brains here, too. So I got a few left up here. I sniff paint for a living. So sometimes it helps to have a little backup, So, bonjour, hindi may maganaduk anin bonjour gakina wiya apichigo migwech bindigen oma apichigo migwech bisandawiak bamosigisha indigenakas wakita wachasha indigo Minoa John Potter indigo Obijeji nidoden Anishinaabe and thou Waswagening and Dunjaba and Pichigo Magwech Bisandawiak Aho. Did you have trouble finding that?
Didn't quite get that last part.
That last part there? Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate you being here anyway. So what you just heard there was a traditional Ojibwe protocol introduction and greeting in a language that has been spoken on Turtle Island here for thousands of years and was almost lost within the past century due to determined efforts by the US government and other forces. A lot of times our elders would say, we're not losing our language is losing us. And it was almost gone for a while, but our language is a language of the land. And the land called the language back. If you want to know the power of story, listen to the land. The land has a story all its own, and we need to listen to that. And not with these, we need to listen here. So the most important word, I think, in that whole introduction was the word In Dinaway Maganadug. Repeat that, please. Come on, you guys can do it. In Dinaway Maganadug. Hey, that was pretty good. Dang. You guys are like apprentice Ojibways. The meaning of that word is all my relatives. What I did was say hello to all my relatives. I said, hello, everybody, welcome, thank you for being here. I offered my name, which is Walking Sky. I'm also called Wakita Wachasha because I'm adopted into a Lakota family, and that means man who looks to the horizon. I belong to the Pine Marten clan, and I come from the place, I descended from the place where they spearfish at night, which over that way, you know, a long way is over that way. I was just pointing east. At least I think that's east. Once I get inside, you know, I'm all turned around. All my relatives. And when we say that word in our language, we're not talking about just our two-legged relatives. We're talking about the relatives that surround us in the community of nature. We didn't have a word for nature, actually. We didn't have a word for wilderness. Our word was home. And so when we were outside, we acknowledged the fact that we were walking among a community of relatives. All things were relative to us. A lot of people say, well, it's all relative. And yeah, it's all relative. It's all our relatives. Everything that breathes, everything that moves, everything that doesn't breathe or move, everything from the stones to the stars, we're all related to them. And so when you walk outside and you're looking around at the trees and the rivers and everything like that, do you think about them as relatives? Do you think about them as relating to them as relatives? Or do you just say, oh, that's just a tree, that's just a bird? No, they're your family. And sometimes family relationships can be difficult. Let's take wolves, for example. The common opinion in the West here about wolves is not that good. But, you know, wolves to our people were our original teachers, our original brothers and sisters. We have stories that go back thousands of years about how a wolf, an original man, walked the earth because Creator told him to. Walk the earth, become relative to all things, understand all things of the natural world, and name all the places and things that you see and find. And so in all the time that wolf and original man walked the earth, they became brothers. They became to know and understand each other. They became to finish each other's sentences, if you will. And when they had finished the task that Creator set forth for them, Creator said, okay, now you guys need to go your separate ways, live your own lives, raise your own families, but never forget the relationship that you have as brothers. And remember also that what happens to one of you will happen to the other. And we as Native people have seen that happen. Both of us, wolves and human beings, were persecuted, driven off our ancestral lands, nearly wiped out, and more imagined than understood. And that therein lies the problem. It's in the imagination that people have of wolves where they go wrong. They don't understand wolves. How many of you grew up with the stories, the horror stories of Little Red Riding Hood, and Three Little Pigs? Yeah, oh, they called them fairy tales, sorry. Horror stories. I heard those stories too. And you know, by all rights, you know, I should have been terrified of wolves listening to those stories. I was never afraid of them. I never felt that fear, you know, and I thought, you know, Little Red Riding Hood and the big bad wolf and the how big your teeth are and everything like that. I mean, if she couldn't recognize that it wasn't her grandma sitting there, she needed to visit her grandma more. And them damn Three Little Pigs, you know, I think they totally deserve to have their damn houses blown down. Shouldn't have been building them on wolf's homeland. They didn't even ask. They just start building there, In my dreams about wolves, I was running with them. I was playing with them. I was hunting with them. I was howling with them. To me, in my dreams, they left footprints in the snow or in the dirt, footprints, tracks for me to step into, not step on. And each one of those footprints was a prayer left for me to understand. So, had a little different relationship with wolves than most people. In fact, I dreamed the other night about wolves, just a couple nights ago. I was on a hill, and there was a pack of wolves on the other hill, and they looked over and they howled, and I howled back, and they just came running over, and they did that whole thing where the pack is together kind of a thing with me in the middle of it all, and it's like wagging tails and licking faces and all that stuff. And well, if you've ever had your face licked by a wolf, it's not that pleasant. But still, there they were. And speaking of relatives, I painted that. They're not wolves, by the way. Thank you. Speaking of relatives, I want to introduce you to my Uncle Nick. Next slide. Yeah, that's my uncle. He's the one on the left. This is my Uncle Nick. Bindigay Gijik was his name. Enters the sky. I just quit drinking about maybe a year or two before that picture was taken, and I'm still kind of pissed off. It looks like, but that was 39 years ago. Next slide, please. This was the single, I always get choked up talking about my uncle. The single most important, influential, and inspirational man in my life. He took me under his wing, literally, taught me everything that he could about what it means to be Ojibwe. Since I never knew my father, this was the guy. Next slide, please. That's me and him about 12 years ago. You can see where I kind of got my penchant for bandanas and stuff. Got it from him. Nick was a craftsman and an artist. We did everything together. I mean, we hunted together. We speared muskies through the ice in the wintertime. We speared walleyes when the lakes opened up in the spring. We harvested manuman, our wild rice. We set up sugar camp and harvested our zinzibakwad, the maple sugar, and jiwe gamasigan, our maple syrup. And we did all that stuff. Next slide, please. Here's Nick with a canoe that he made, Mikwas Jaman, a birch bark canoe. He had this whole compound out in the woods. His setup was called Waswaganing, and he would bring tour groups from all over the country and all over the world and teach people about our Ojibwe culture and history from season to season to season. And he made everything. And he was an incredible artist. We'd sit there and paint and draw together all the time. And he would look at the stuff I was doing, and he would say, John Boy, he called me that. He said, Creator gave you a gift. You need to use this gift. With a gift like this comes great responsibility. You need to use this gift to help people understand the quiet dignity of the natural world. He said, you need to use your gift to get out there and fight the enemy. And I'm like, yeah, fight the enemy. I'm going to fight the white man. I'm all aim and everything like that. I'm going to go out there and kick some ass. And he's like, no, John Boy, settle down. He said, the enemy is ignorance. That's enemy, everybody's enemy. He said, use your gift to help educate people about who we were, who we are today, our relationship with the natural world, and who we can all be together if we just learn to listen. Listen to each other instead of forcing your agenda on everybody else. So I'm like, well, no pressure, Uncle, but sure. Okay, I'll do that. So what follows is kind of a step-by-step guide as to how one becomes a famous artist. Or at least my journey, anyway. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, that was a picture taken about a month before he walked on, took the Wolves Trail. Yeah, and I knew he was going, so that's why I'm not all smiles in that one. Next, please. So, first step in being a famous artist is being born, I guess. I think I was chubbier than that, actually, but yeah, I think I got switched at birth, too. At least my mom thinks so. She's like, I think you were raised by wolves. And I'm like, yeah, I think so, too. So yeah, once you're born, next slide, please. At some point in your artistic journey as an artist, there's something about white space. It's anxiety-causing, but it's also thrilling because you got to fill it up. You know, you see a blank wall. Like when I was growing up, we had white walls. I'd draw on there with a magic marker. And drawing on the walls, drawing on the refrigerator. One day, I discovered my stepdad, who was non-native, taking a nap on a hot day. Didn't have much on, and I thought, look at all that white space. So I snuck in the room there with my magic marker, and I started drawing him up like he was, a beef chart in a supermarket. I was marking him up, and I thought he was sleeping soundly through the whole thing, but he woke up about halfway through and grabbed me, and I said, I didn't do it. Magic marker's right there. And I don't remember anything else that happened today. Yeah, so I survived that, and then next slide, please. Went to high school. I was not what you'd call a model student, but went to high school, and my high school art teacher told me I had no future as an artist. After I showed her this drawing I was working on, she said, you have no future as an artist. You got no ambition, you got no drive, you're out there with your hoodlum buddies in the parking lot all the time, so you just do something else. She actually said she'd just go back to the res and be a drunk like the rest of you. So, she was an elder. Even though she wasn't native, she was an elder. I was taught to listen to my elders, even though I didn't like what she was saying. So I went to Utah State University, studied wildlife science. Quickly discovered that there was science involved with wildlife science. That part of my brain either never existed or never developed. Luckily, Utah State had a great art program, so I ended up double majoring in illustration and fine art. Yeah, okay, next one, please. And finally, like Jerry said, 1982, after roaming the country half naked and starving for a while, I ended up at the Billings Gazette. And somehow they took me in as the newsroom artist. I spent almost 20 years there, doing everything from editorial cartoons to wildlife illustration to courtroom sketches, the whole thing, one-person art department. Great job, but not exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I wanted to be a painter. I wanted to paint the natural world and do what my uncle told me to do. That was my story. I wanted my story to be in canvas, or in paint on canvas. So next slide, please. This is our recent painting here. Nick told me, my uncle told me, if you want to find your story in nature, or if you want to find your place in nature, go find your place in nature. So I did. Part of my artistic journey was being out there in nature for days. I'd be out in the woods for days, and I'd take a sketchbook with me. That was my sustenance. I'd be out there for days, and once you're sitting there still out in the natural world, birds and animals just kind of come around you. And I would start drawing them and stuff like that, and I'd start recognizing them every day, and they became more family to me than my family at home. I started recognizing their kids. I started recognizing their grandkids. My place in nature was being in nature, sitting there and drawing. And Nick would say, you know, the land has the story that you need to tell, so go out there and listen. So that's what I did. By the way, this is the look that my mom would give me when I came back from the woods. After several days out there, you know, and that was before cell phones and all that, so she didn't know where I was or how I was or anything like that. So I'd come walking in, you know, smelling like the outdoors, and she'd be giving me that look. Next slide, please. So 1995, I'm sitting there at Billings Gazette minding my own business, and I get a phone call from my brother. And he says, Yellowstone Park has invited him to come and do welcoming and adoption ceremonies for the wolves that are being reintroduced in the park. And I want you to come along as my singer. Given the fact that among my people, wolves are the ones who have given us the most in the natural world, of course I jumped at that. So next thing you know, we're headed to Yellowstone, a cold night in the winter of '95. And we showed up at Gardner, and the ranger met us there, and he said, well, sorry to tell you this, fellas, but the wolves have been held up in Great Falls. The Department of Livestock and the DOJ have placed an injunction against the wolves being returned to the park, so they're up there and they're not coming. You can go home if you want. And I'm like, heck no. I mean, we came here to do a ceremony. We're doing ceremony. So they took us up in Lamar Valley, and we found one of those big mule-drawn sleighs that they were going to bring the wolves in on. We did our ceremony up on top of that sleigh. My brother was doing pipe, and I was singing, and we got done, and next thing you know, another truck pulls up with another ranger in there, and he jumps out, he's all excited and everything, and he's like, hey, the injunction's been lifted, they're coming. So, yeah, power of prayer. Not that we had anything to do with that, you know, we were just there doing our thing. The next year, we went up there for the second round of reintroduction of the wolves, and we got to be, yeah, they're from Canada. Next year, we got to be there when they were releasing the wolves into the acclimation pens. So they're bringing the wolves one by one in these big crates, and they throw the door open, the wolves see all those people, and they just go bolting to the other end of the acclimation pen, a 1 acre fenced in area. And except for the last wolf, I mean, we're doing our pipe ceremony, I'm singing, they're letting the wolves out into the pens like 10 feet behind us. This last wolf steps out and looks around at all the people. It's this big black wolf like that. Steps out, looks at all the people, and just throws his head back and howls. That was a moment. So, as you can imagine, there was a lot of anti-wolf sentiment out there. And if you look hard enough, you can find it. All you got to do is go into a bar and say, hey, I like wolves. I think wolves are cool. Yeah, and one of their biggest arguments of the people who were against wolves being here is that they weren't American wolves. They came from Canada, so they were foreign wolves. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that was one of the cartoons I did. Aroo, eh? You know, imagine, if you will, you're a native person, and you hear somebody say, but they're not from around here. They're foreigners. Okay. Run with that. The next thing that happened, of course, with the anti-wolf sentiment building up was one of the wolves who had been recently released was shot and killed near Red Lodge, where I live. Next slide. And as the newsroom artist, you know, the case, they caught the guy, and they drag his ass into court, you know, and it's federal court, so there's no cameras allowed, so I'm a newsroom artist, I get to go do courtroom sketches of this, I can't say the word. So I'm sitting there drawing him and everything like that, and I'm boiling inside, and his defense was that he thought it was a dog. And like, that's any better? So here was a glossary that I came up with for a guy who wants to go out and kill wolves. You have a rat over there. In a wolf killer's mind, it's a bunny rabbit. Rattlesnake, kitty cat. A wolf over there with a collar on. Oh, it's just a puppy dog. I'm going to shoot it. And then there's the killer, jailbird. We ran that one and we got a lot of heat from our reading public. But, you know, as my job as a political cartoonist and editorial cartoonist and stuff, I was told if you're not pissing somebody off or making them laugh, you're not doing your job. Next slide, please. Yeah, I did that one too for the editorial page. I could relate to that one because I didn't know my daddy either. Yeah, so they finally caught up with the mother who had pups at that time. They found her, I think it was on Mount Maurice, wasn't it? See, I have my brother and my sister-in-law down here, and I can't believe how lucky I am to have the support of these people in my life. Miigwech, Wopila. And last but not least, I got my sweetie down there too, and holy, she's a big support. Yeah, I'm so happy you're here, Miigwech. Didn't know you were going to get called out in it. Okay, next slide, please. So as you can tell, if you read the newspapers or listen to the news, anti-wolf sentiment has not eased up whatsoever. Did this cartoon about 3 years ago. It seems as though there is an all-out assault on the natural world in general, but especially on keynote species like wolves, buffaloes, bear, and stuff. So it's all in the way we see the world, you know. A friend of mine who's an Ojibwe scholar, he said, you know, we don't see the world as it is. We see ourselves only. And by that, I think he meant, you know, we only see the world through our lens, our heart, our opinions, our biases, our egos. We don't see the world as it is. And these people who see wolves like this do not understand wolves and don't care to understand wolves. Next slide, please. This is how I see wolves. This is how I have seen wolves. This is the lens that I look at wolves through. It's been said that human beings are the animals most like wolves, or that wolves are the most like humans. I don't know, but I think humans are the most like wolves. We just don't want to admit it. You know, and my favorite book by Barry Lopez was Of Wolves and Men, and one of the best things I remember from that book is that he said that almost on every continent, wolves and human beings grew up together. Human beings, the success of human beings was largely in part of their observation of and their understanding of wolves. Watching wolves hunt cooperatively in packs taught human beings to do the same thing. Watching wolves organize their families, their clan systems, if you will, helped human beings understand fidelity to one's own. So we owe a lot to wolves. I mean, if there's anybody out there who's hunters, if you guys like hunting elk, thank a wolf. Elk move and act and behave and look, and they are elk because of what wolves have shaped them into being. Wolves help them become what they are, just as wolves have helped us become what we are. Next slide. This is how I see wolves. You know, we have a ceremony among our people that commonly known as Vision Quest. We call it going out and starving for a few days and hoping nothing eats you. I've done this a bunch of times, and a couple of times in Yellowstone. And I asked the backcountry field office if I could be put somewhere like in between a bear management zone and a wolf management zone. And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. Like, are you nuts? You know, you can't take food up in there. And I said, I know, I'm not taking food up there. I am going to be the food. And on one of those occasions, wolves came while I was up there. And it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. Next. This is how I see wolves. They deeply love each other. Members of the pack are so devoted to one another that human beings could take a lesson from that as well. Next, please. And yet, we still have this kind of sentiment out there. In Montana and Wyoming, it's legal to hunt wolves by any means possible. Snares, bait, traps, infrared scopes. You can drag the pups out of the dens and kill them, which is what the Park Service did itself in Yellowstone, actually, in 1926. Took the last wolves out of the den and killed them. So yeah, this kind of sentiment is still out there, and people are still looking through that particular lens, that, you know, they're the enemy. And like Native people, wolves were demonized. They were seen as the enemy. They were seen as subhuman and not worthy of being on this planet, and especially on this continent, where, you know, the onward march of manifest destiny was out there to basically turn this into another world. Next, please. This is one of my recent pieces also. It's over there at the Dana Gallery right now. It's called No Gray Area. There's a reason for that, because you look at the painting, there's a white wolf and there's a black wolf. And that's how the socio-political system in this country views wolves, black or white. There's no gray wolf in there, and there's no gray area when it comes to wolves. People either love them or hate them. And neither one is good for wolves. I have a deep respect and admiration for them, but I'm not going to go out there and start petting them. You know? They licked my face, but that was a dream, okay? But I do love going out there and watching them, and lucky enough, I know some of the wolf biologists in the park, and I just call them up and head out there, and we're on wolves right away. Next, please. Oh man, I'm running over. This is also how I see wolves, communicating with the natural world around them. They taught us to do the same thing. They move through the world reverently, quietly, and respectfully. And these guys, ravens and wolves, are buddies. They talk to each other all the time. In fact, they'll come along and they'll tell wolves where they found a carcass, and they'll have wolves come and open it up for them. I've seen them lead wolves to prey animals who are sick or dying, and the wolves take care of things. You know, among our people, we're taught that, you know, all of creation was given a job by Creator. Every living thing in the natural world was given a job by Creator and given the perfect tools to do that job. And when everybody does their job to perfection, there's harmony and there's balance. You remove somebody from the equation, like wolves or any other keystone species, and the ecosystem fails. That's been shown scientifically. And so, you know, scientists are starting to catch up with us natives. Next, please. You know, how many of you know about the land back movement? Land back? Yeah, there's quite a few out there. That's good. Land back is about, you know, restoration of native systems, acquisition of native land, reacquisition, sustaining food, indigenous food systems, honoring treaties. There's a lot that's underneath the umbrella of the land back movement. I think this is part of the land back movement, bringing wildlife, keystone species, native wildlife back to their homelands. The land is calling them home, and there are people that listen, people who can do something about it. We recently saw that movie called Bring Them Home, a documentary film about bringing the buffalo back to Blackfeet Res. And that's basically what this painting is all about. Next, please. Yeah. Next, please. Who doesn't like to sit out in the sun, you know? They're just like us. Next, please. Yeah. Again. And, you know, they love to play. I mean, they're just like people. I like to play too, but most of the time I'm locked up in the studio, which is playtime. Next, please. So this painting here goes back to the story about original man and wolf walking the earth and naming all the places and things. And if you look real close, it's called ancestral ties. If you look real close in that bush by that wolf in the foreground, there are tobacco ties left there by someone who was fasting in that place and had a dream about wolves, so he left tobacco ties there for them, which is our way of feeding their spirit. That's a long story for another time. Next, please. So anyway, last year I saw this photograph pop up in my digital feeding trough. And I was immediately moved by this image. It's taken by a Blackfeet tribal member when the buffalo were being released below Chief Mountain there. I got a hold of him, I asked permission, I said, man, I gotta paint from this image. This speaks to everything that I've been working for my whole life, bringing back wildlife to where they belong. And he said, yeah, go ahead, you know, just cut me a check for a bunch of zeros, fine. No, he didn't say that. But that was the inspiration for this painting here. You know, to find your place in nature, get out in nature. That's the only thing I can tell you. And don't go buzzing around out there on your motorbikes and everything like that, and tearing up the landscape, either four-wheelers or four-wheel drive vehicles and everything. Get out there and sit. Sit still, be quiet, calm your heart down, let go of all the crap that's going on in your head, and pretty soon the natural world is just going to come to you and tell you what it wants you to know. That's a fasting ceremony in a nutshell right there. They're going to feed your spirit because your spirit needs it. We all need it. Next. You know, and for those of us in this room, the speakers here today, whom I deeply admire, the land speaks to us and motivates us to do something, you know, to take care of climate change, take care of the wildlife, take care of bringing back indigenous cultures and language and stuff. It's all what the earth wants, especially this earth, Turtle Island. And those of us who can do something about it, you know, and even if you can't, you know, just donate to a cause or something. But listen to what's going on in your heart, and when you do, it's a good reflection on you, eh? Next. There you have it, in a nutshell. Chimagwech, Pichigo Magwech, Bizandawik, Pichigo Magwech, Bintagain Oma, Gikawabamin, Mi'u, that's all. Thank you. I wasn't expecting that.
We have time for maybe just two questions, and we're going to break for lunch. So if anybody has any questions out there for John?
There's a couple.
Yeah, we have a couple here.
Here you go.
We'll get a microphone down here. Hurry up, Adrien. Move it, move it.
Thank you so much, John. I'm curious if you got to see the white bison this spring or have any thoughts about the white buffalo and white buffalo calf woman. Or
Yeah, there was a bit of an echo there. Could you?
Oh, the white buffalo? Did you get to see the white buffalo this spring?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that story was big news about the white buffalo over this past spring and summer. You know, and I think most of you know probably why that event was so important to many of our people. The story is specific to the Lakota especially, but a lot of tribes have, latched onto that as well as an omen for something good that's going to happen and a bright future. But it's not going to happen without us doing something about it. That event was meant to motivate human beings to action. And those kind of things are meant for us to wake up and listen and see what we can do to, climate change and all that stuff. It's just affecting all of us, not just Native people, not just our wildlife, but our whole planet. My uncle would say, solar panels, clean energy, recycling, all these things are really good things to do, but until and unless we see our Earth as a spiritual being and not just a rock floating around the sun, none of these things are going to work. So we all need to alter our perspective about this good mother that we live upon, that we all call our mom. And one of the ways she speaks to us is through events like that, the white buffalo coming. I've heard that the little one hasn't been seen since then. My feeling, I don't know anything, but my feeling is that, the family is gathered around and protecting that one. And even if she's not even alive anymore, she did her thing. She did what she came here to do. Thanks for the question.
You are an animal.
You just called me an animal, and I'm like...
I called him an animal. I said, "Hey, you're an animal." He said, sincerely, he said, "Thank you." Thank you, John.
Thank you.
By the way, if you want to see more, if you want to see some of John's art, he currently has an exhibit going with 20 of his works up at the Dana Gallery, just a couple of blocks up the road here. With that, we're going to break for lunch. We'll be back here at 1:30.